Madam Presiding Officer, recognizing that it is 6 minutes after 4:30, as Leader of Assembly Business, I beg to move that this House remains seated until all the business on the order paper are dealt with, and I would then present if you so oblige.
Honorable members, the question is that we remain seated until the business of the day is completed. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. You may now join this debate.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, esteemed members of this august House, residents of the electoral district of Bethesda-Leketo, and members of this community of Tobago, good afternoon to each of you. I rise this afternoon on this terrific Carnival Thursday afternoon to contribute to this crucial debate, recognizing that many speakers before me have underscored the history, the urgency, and the deep aspirations behind Tobago's call to become self-actualized. Our demand, Madam Presiding Officer, is not new. It has been persistent and a just cause that has been the echo for almost 5 decades, from 1977 until today. We seek more than just minor adjustments or administrative reforms, Madam Presiding Officer and the people of Tobago. In fact, we demand true self-determination, and this motion, as amended by the Honorable Deputy Chief Secretary, represents a vital step towards achieving this goal. Madam Presiding Officer, the motion as presented by the minority leader, though cloaked in the language of progress, is laced with subterfuge and mendacity. It is an exercise in duplicity crafted with a sophistry that attempts to obscure the deeper issues at hand. The motion reeks of half-hearted commitments, promising change while retaining the disingenuousness that has plagued our quest to determine our destinies for ourselves. Madam Presiding Officer, it is therefore imperative that we see beyond this facade and address the true statements and substance of our demands for self-determination that is free from deceptive half-truths. Madam Presiding Officer, before I get into it, let me, for elucidation's sake, remind the people of Tobago, remind the people of Trinidad and Tobago how we got here in the first place. It is a known fact that the Tobago House of Assembly is this country's oldest political institution. The THA was first incarnated in 1768 on the islands, or in the islands rather, former capital of Georgetown, which is now Studley Park. The capital moved to Scarborough in 1769, as did the offices of the 13-member elected House of Assembly, which was the lower house, and the appointed Legislative Council, which was the upper house. In 1877, Madam Presiding Officer, representative government was abolished, with the Crown Colony introduced to handle the administration of the island. In 1889, Tobago was joined with Trinidad by the British government. Madam Presiding Officer, our demand for self-determination is therefore not new. It began with the late Honorable A.N.R. Robinson in 1977, who declared before Parliament, Madam Presiding Officer, that the people of Tobago have a right to a meaningful say in their own affairs. Following the 1976 general election, where the PNM lost both parliamentary seats to the Tobago-led DAC, which of course Robinson was a leader at that time, this led to a hostile response from then Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams, something we're very familiar with in and around December 6, 2021. The Ministry of Tobago Affairs was disbanded, effectively punishing Tobago for not supporting the People's National Movement. In response, Madam Presiding Officer, Robinson, who had become the MP for Tobago East at that time, introduced a motion in the House of Representatives on January 14th, 1977. Listen, the motion in its entirety had a resolution that is very dear to me, and it goes, be it resolved that this honorable House is of the opinion that all proper and necessary steps should be taken to accord the people of Tobago internal self-government. This motion was seconded by the late Dr. Winston Murray, MP of Tobago West, who spoke passionately about Tobago's cultural preservation and the island's neglect by the central government. But let me stick a pin here to emphasize how vociferous, how passionate, how genuine representatives of this island are when they stand up for the people of Tobago, unattached to the people's national movement. That was a time when the two Tobago representatives truly served the people of Tobago and not Balize House. But I digress. Madam Presiding Officer, at that time, the PNM's response was to amend the motion to preserve the concept of their proposed unitary state framework, initiating the thrust for internal self-governance as an attempt at secession. The Honorable Overand Padmore, Minister in the Ministry of Finance, aggressively advanced this narrative, dismissing the legitimate grievances and historical injustices raised by Robinson and Murray. It is within this context that the political warfare between Trinidad and Tobago must be understood. Madam Presiding Officer, it is a deep-seated desire for self-government rooted in a history of colonial and post-colonial neglect, which was further exacerbated by the central government's punitive response to the 1976 election results. Madam Presiding Officer, the introduction of Act 37 in 1980, which re-established, and I'm using that word because I gave you the history of the oldest legislative body being the THA. So re-established the Tobago House of Assembly, and this, of course, was an important step. However, as Dr. Winston Murray noted during the debates, it was only the beginning. Our journey had just begun, and we didn't even know it at that time. It, however, granted administrative powers, but left key areas, such as budgetary control, under the centralized power of Port of Spain. When Act 40 of 1996 was passed, Madam Presiding Officer, it was expected to correct these deficiencies by granting Tobago more control over crucial sectors such as education, health, and finance. Yet, the central government continued to control our development funds and legislative authority, leaving this assembly with responsibilities but not the corresponding powers to enact meaningful change. Madam Presiding Officer, self-determination is a recognized human right under international law, and my colleague, Secretary for Tourism, took great pains into explaining what these human rights are. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants affirm the right of all peoples to determine their political status and to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Let me repeat that. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants affirm the right of all peoples to determine their political status and to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Our pursuit of self-determination, therefore, Madam Presiding Officer, aligns with these principles and reflects a long-standing demand for the ability to govern ourselves in a way that addresses our unique circumstances and our aspirations. Madam Presiding Officer, despite multiple legislative attempts over the years, the central government and most times the PNM-led central government has consistently failed to provide a framework for true self-determination for Tobago. The inadequacy of the 1996 Act was starkly highlighted by the 2015 case, Tobago House of Assembly versus Attorney General, which showed that the Act did not grant us sufficient powers to govern our own affairs effectively. Similarly, Madam Presiding Officer, the 2013 Constitutional Amendment Bill aimed to enhance Tobago's internal self-governance. But, as then Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar herself noted, the goal was to place a substantial part of the responsibility for Tobago's affairs in the hands of its residents. That goal remains largely unrealized to this day. Madam Presiding Officer, the current bills fail to adequately address the issues of Tobago's maritime boundaries, and I'm going to start there. These current bills. Former Chief Secretary, the Honorable Orville London, his 2016 draft called for a 200 nautical mile maritime boundary. Yet the latest legislative proposals do not only neglect PNM Chief Secretary claim, your own former Chief Secretary's claim, but also remove the existing 6-mile boundary from recognition. And we've been bringing it up, it's popping up here, it's popping up there. The point is, you've asked for something, the people of Tobago gave you the opportunity through consultation, lengthy consultation at that. We came up with particulars that were non-negotiable, and still, the bill that is being done, or the bills that are being dangled in front of us, have not given us not even half of that. These omissions severely limits Tobago's control over its resources, and it undermines the very fabric of the island's economic potential. For true self-determination to be achieved, Madam Presiding Officer, our territorial waters must be explicitly defined and our rights over them protected. Madam Presiding Officer, it is evident that discussions around autonomy tend to gain traction only around the election periods. It is no coincidence. I feel like we have these conversations in or around. It's almost like you can smell the fact that the election bell is about to ring because the conversations conveniently come up. My colleague, Dr. Faith B. Israel, my colleague, Assemblyman Pollard, my colleague, he's not in the house today, Assemblyman Baines, our Chief Secretary, and Assemblyman Duke, we sat in spaces where right before that December 6th election, we had this dangled in front of us, coming out of major conversations right in that 2020 election where Councillor Boris and Assemblyman Duke were the candidates. And so it's always a political football that comes into this space in or around the election. And, you know, we feel that with the general election and or the THA election impending, they're once again being used as campaign tools rather than being pursued with genuine commitment. Dr. the Honorable Keith Christopher Rowley has previously described these efforts, these same efforts, as smoke and mirrors, where the substance of autonomy is sacrificed at the altar of political expediency. And of course, you know, these conversations come when you're in opposition. And then when you're in governance, when you're actually the government and have the opportunity, even at points in time where you're governing both Trinidad and Tobago, you don't see the passion, the fervor, the vigor in actually making it happen. And so this time, the people of Tobago, I'm speaking to you, we must ensure that our right to self-determination is recognized as a fundamental necessity and not an electoral afterthought. Madam Presiding Officer, for Tobago to achieve a true self-determination, a point that has been reiterated over and over in this House, financial equity must be established. The current allocations are insufficient for meaningful development. And Prime Minister Dr. Rowley, and it's strange that I'm quoting him, but he himself highlighted that the share of the national budget allocated to the Assembly is at its minimum. If we are to govern ourselves effectively, we must have the financial resources necessary as an island to make strategic investments according to our needs that are free from restrictive oversight by the central government. Of course, you're in opposition and so you're speaking like this. But Madam Presiding Officer, Tobago's pursuit of autonomy requires legislative power over areas such as what we spoke to. And we have an entire schedule of them, and yet we see all the encroachment happening and everything disguised as ministries will come to Tobago and do X, Y, and Z while our development program is underfunded. We must also have jurisdiction over land management and natural resource exploitation. It was Dr. Eric Williams himself who stated in 1957 that Tobago, as an island detached from Trinidad, cannot simply be equated with any district on mainland Trinidad. His acknowledgement of Tobago's unique status must be reflected in the laws governing our island and in our pursuit of self-determination. The two states, one country model, as expressed by many Tobagonians even in those consultations, presents a viable solution. And I know every time we discuss it, we have the conversation about if it's a marriage, you all want to walk out. We never spoke to federation, if it's federation, but it came up in the consultations. And it is a viable solution for Tobago's self-determination, Madam Presiding Officer, because it acknowledges the island as an equal partner within the Republic. Similar models have been successfully implemented, and I heard my colleagues speaking to it before, in regions such as Scotland and Quebec, where local legislative and executive powers coexist with shared responsibilities at the national level. It is time for Trinidad and Tobago to adopt a governance structure that respects Tobago's autonomy while maintaining the unity of the state. Madam Presiding Officer, allow me to end with a story. I sat here and I listened to my colleagues and I said, you know, sometimes we come in here and of course, being so passionate, we speak the jargon of the intellects and sometimes the layman terms. You have to find a way to break it down where every child, every single parent, the man working on the side of the road, the man who is a barber, you know, everybody can understand the story. And I said, you know what? I am a woman. Let me think of a story that would probably, through my words or through my eyes, explain what I think we're grappling with here. Madam Presiding Officer, let's think about a woman known for her hard work, for her beauty, and for her resourcefulness. She lives on her own, tending to a small piece of land that has been in her family name for generations. She grew sugarcane, fruits, and other crops, and for a long time, her land flourished. Her garden provided more than enough for her to live on and even share with her neighbors. Life was simple, but she was proud of it. She had a way of doing things passed down from her ancestors, and she knew her land like the back of her hand. But over time, Madam Presiding Officer, things changed. The soil wasn't as rich as it used to be. Storms had damaged parts of her garden, and the markets weren't paying as much for her crops as they used to. The world outside her little patch of earth was changing, and it became harder and harder for her to get by. Even though she worked just as hard as always, there simply wasn't enough to keep up with the cost of running her household. So over the years, Madam Presiding Officer, different men tried to take over her land. They saw her hard times as an opportunity to claim what she had, thinking they could manage it better or use the land for their own plans. She had fought off these attempts time and time again. As a matter of fact, about 33 times. Each time, she managed to hold on to her home, but the constant battles left her weary. Eventually, it was decided by others, not her, people she didn't even have a say over, that she should marry a man who lived in a big fancy house nearby. It wasn't a marriage she wanted, Madam Presiding Officer. She was forced into it. But she was told it would bring her stability and help her get back on her feet. Madam Presiding Officer, this man's house was larger and had more resources, and combining their lives was supposed to be the solution for her struggles. But when she moved in, it became clear that things weren't as equal as promised. The man took charge, making decisions about the house and the garden without ever consulting her. when she was still expected to tend to the land, but her efforts now served his plans rather than her own. The little say she had in how things were done was quickly overshadowed by the rules of the larger household, and she soon found herself in a life where her own voice was often ignored. Even with these challenges, Madam Presiding Officer, the woman's spirit remained strong. She knew her land had value beyond crops. It was beautiful with rolling hills, clear streams, and a peaceful atmosphere that couldn't be found anywhere else. As the agricultural work continued to struggle, she started to rely more on inviting guests to come to stay with her. She hosted travelers who came to enjoy the scenery, to explore her natural beauty, and to celebrate the tradition she had kept alive. The festival she held and the hospitality she offered began to sustain her in a different way, turning her home into a place where people could connect with her natural beauty, her rich culture, and her priceless historical artifacts that could be found around her home. Madam Presiding Officer, this new chapter...
Members, if he rises on a point of order, you have to give way. Please. Can I have your point of order?
Relevance, the story been going a while, and I just want to bring it home back to...
Thank you, Minority Leader. Continue.
Madam Presiding Officer, this new chapter helped her to stay afloat, but it was bittersweet. She still longed for the days when she could make decisions about her own life without needing someone else's approval. She didn't want to leave the marriage altogether, but she wanted to be able to manage her part of the household on her terms, to shape the future of her land and her life as she saw fit. And so, Madam Presiding Officer, she continued to speak up, not for separation, at least not yet, but for respect and for balance, for equity, Madam Presiding Officer. She wanted a partnership where her voice was heard, where the knowledge and care she had put into her land was recognized. She knew she could thrive if given the freedom to do things her way, just like she had done before. But it wasn't just about getting by, Madam Presiding Officer. It was about living with dignity, making her own choices and holding on to the traditions that had kept her strong through every struggle. Her story was not just about a difficult marriage, Madam Presiding Officer, but it was about the enduring will to fight for the life she deserved, to find new ways of doing things, and to never lose sight of who she was. Madam Presiding Officer, and even today as I end, I want Tobago to understand that it's currently at crossroads in its marriage with Trinidad. And just like the woman in my story, Madam Presiding Officer, Tobago's voice deserves to be heard, her contributions recognized, and her autonomy respected within this union. This is not about separation, at least not yet, Madam Presiding Officer, but about redefining the partnership, the marriage, rather, to honor both parties' strengths and histories. For true unity cannot be achieved by control or imposed decisions. It must be built on mutual respect, Madam Presiding Officer, where both Tobago and Trinidad can flourish together, each with the freedom to shape its own destiny while still moving forward as one nation. The time has come for Tobago to not just follow the path set by another, but to walk beside her partner, equal in voice and power, steering her own course towards a shared, dignified future. And Madam Presiding Officer, as I close, the current bills before us offer incremental changes that have been long-standing, but they are not sufficient to meet Tobago's demands. We require comprehensive legislative powers, financial equity, and clearly defined territorial rights. The people of Tobago, Madam Presiding Officer, have waited for far too long for the realization of our right to self-determination. And so at this juncture, let us ensure that this moment is not lost to superficial gestures. The call for true self-determination is now louder than ever, and we must respond with resolve and action. I thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.